The kettle had just clicked off when the front door opened. I poured hot water over 2 slices of lemon and set the cup beside a folded cloth napkin. Graham always liked it that way. No sugar, just lemon and linen. I used to find that endearing. Now it just reminded me how everything had to be his way. He was 20 minutes late. No apology. Just a gust of cold air and the scent of expensive cologne drifting through the hall. Traffic, he mumbled, already pocketing his phone. I offered him tea. He didn't touch it. We sat in the sunroom, or rather I sat, while he paced, half listening to himself as he talked about refinancing market timing, how homes like this are becoming gold mines. I nodded, where polite. I'd learned not to interrupt when he was performing. I asked how Kendra was. He waved it off. She's in a meeting. You know how it is. I didn't. I'm gonna head upstairs real quick to hop on a Zoom, he said. After a while. Just one call. Then we'll talk about the back patio situation. I watched him climb the stairs 2 at a time, already talking to someone as he disappeared into Era's old study. I cleared the table, folded the napkin, and made my way up to fetch the laundry basket from the hall closet. As I reached the landing, I heard his voice calmer, now colder. She's not suspicious. Everything's smooth so far. Honestly, this timing is perfect. She's slowing down, fast. Silence. Then his voice again, firmer this time. If we start the process with Veritas next week, we could list before September. The market's hot. She won't last another year anyway. I froze in place. The study door was half closed, his voice drifting through the crack like smoke. No, she won't put up a fight. She's soft. We just have to frame it as a safety issue. I turned slowly and stepped back down the stairs. He didn't see me, but I had seen enough, and I had heard everything. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains I'd sewn myself 30 years ago. They still held their shape, the hems stitched, while Era and I listened to jazz on the kitchen radio, the smell of wood stain heavy in the air. Back then, we didn't have much, but we had plans, sketches spread across the table, dreams etched into paper that would one day become this house. I walked slowly through each room, my fingers grazing the familiar edges. The archway between the kitchen and dining room, we'd cut that ourselves, tracing a half-moon shape with a dinner plate and holding our breath as we sawed. The banister sanded smooth during one cold winter when we couldn't afford heat all day. The yellow trim around the pantry door was still chipped in the corner where Graham had run into it on his tricycle. He cried. I remember holding him, whispering that the house would always catch him, always hold him. And now he wanted to sell it. Not live in it, not raise his children here, just convert it into profit. In the study, I reached for the old filing cabinet tucked beneath my desk and pulled out the folder labeled House Deed and Records. It had been years since I'd opened it. Inside, everything was still crisp. Era's name, mine, the joint title. I shuffled to the back eyes, landing on the amendment dated the year he passed full transfer to Thelina Corbin. I was the sole owner. Have been for almost 9 years. I stood still for a long moment. The silence in the house wasn't empty. It was watchful. It was as if the walls themselves had been listening to Graham's words, waiting. I crossed the yard and knocked on Emmerich's door. He opened it with his usual half-smile cardigan buttoned wrong at the top. I need to ask you something, I said. About property? Ownership. Legally. He didn't hesitate. Come in, Thelina. By the time I left his house an hour later, everything I had ever wondered about right signatures and quiet power was no longer a question. I walked home, opened the pantry, and reached for the manila envelope labeled Plans. The carrot cake rose unevenly in the oven, just like it always did without Era's touch. He used to add a bit of orange zest, never measuring, just feeling. I hadn't baked it in years. There didn't seem much reason to until today, my 71st birthday. I set the small cake on the cooling rack, opened a single-place setting at the kitchen table, and poured myself half a cup of decaf. No candles, no music. Just the sound of the radiator ticking in its usual rhythm and the distant creak of old floorboards adjusting to the cold. By 5 o'clock, I had given up pretending. The phone stayed quiet until 4:53 when Graham's text arrived. "Hope you're well, Mom. Crazy week. Talk soon." That was it. 10 words for the woman who gave him 28 hours of labor and 3 decades of home-cooked meals. I didn't reply. I sat in silence, fork balanced on the rim of the plate, watching shadows climb the wall. I wasn't angry. Not in the way people usually mean it. I was filled with something colder clarity. Later that night, out of habit, I checked the social apps I barely used. There they were, Graham and Kendra, at a vineyard in the Finger Lakes, arm-in-arm, wine glasses in hand. The caption read, "Due estate planning weekend." I stared at it for a long time, trying to decide which word stung more, estate or planning. That evening, I went down to the basement where the old files were stored in plastic bins. I found the envelope immediately, the one Era and I labeled plans in thick marker back in 2002. Inside were floor plans, budget breakdowns, receipts for every hinge, every gallon of paint, every hour of labor. Era's handwriting filled the margins with measurements and doodles. Tucked behind the last blueprint was a sketch I hadn't seen in years, our first drawing of the bay window. He'd labeled it "Reading Nook for Thelina" with a heart scribbled underneath. I pressed the paper to my chest, then laid it flat again, smoothing it with the side of my palm. Graham didn't just misunderstand this house. He erased everything that made it sacred. So I opened my address book, flipped to the letter S, and circled a name I hadn't thought about in years. Verity Stokes answered on the second ring, her voice low and composed, like someone who dealt in secrets for a living. I told her I'd been given her number years ago by a couple in town who'd quietly sold their generational farmhouse to a preservation group. She remembered them. She remembered a lot of things. We met 2 days later at dusk. She wore slate gray wool and had eyes that didn't need to ask why an old woman was calling about discreet listings. We walked the perimeter of my property together. She didn't compliment the rose trellises or the detailed trim beneath the eaves. She didn't have to. Inside, she paused only once in the parlor, where the original crown molding curved gently above the fireplace. "You restored this," she said, not as a question. "My husband and I replied. Verity nodded and pulled out a slim folder. "If you're ready," she said, "I can find buyers who respect legacy over leverage." That word legacy landed softly. I agreed. Not with a signature, not yet, but with a quiet yes that settled in my bones. She told me she'd keep it private off market, for now circulated only to those who didn't need to tour a house to know its value. The next morning, Graham called. Thinking we might repaint the facade this summer, he said casually, "Brighten the place up. White trim navy shutters, maybe." I stared at the phone before answering. "That won't be necessary." There was a pause. "You okay, Mom? I'm just fine," I said, and hung up before his fake concern could sour the rest of my morning. By noon, Verity had emailed a tentative proposal. It was more than I expected. The kind of offer that didn't ask questions, just expressed reverence for craftsmanship and history. I walked to the bay window and sat where Era used to read. For the first time in years, I imagined someone else sitting here. A stranger maybe, but one who would leave the heart of the house untouched. Later that afternoon, I opened the hall closet, retrieved the key box, and began sorting the old brass sets by room. The snow had melted just enough to leave slush on the porch steps. I'd slipped slightly, carrying in the mail a small reminder that my knees no longer cooperated the way they once had. Inside, I sorted through the envelopes, mostly catalogs and offers I hadn't asked for, until I reached one with Graham's name printed across the top in block letters. It wasn't sealed. just folded carelessly and tucked into the stack, likely forgotten during his last visit. The letterhead bore the name of a mortgage company in Rhinebeck. I sat at the kitchen table, opened it, and read. It was a conditional pre-approval for a home loan. A sizable one. Under assets. Supporting application, it listed an expected sale of a private residential property, Corbin Residence, Hudson Valley. No address, but it didn't need one. I knew exactly what house he meant. My hands didn't shake. Not this time. I read the rest. He and Kendra had already toured a house, a 5-bedroom colonial with a wine cellar and sunroom. I wondered if they imagined themselves hosting clients there, or if they'd already planned where my armchair would be donated. There was no mention of me in the paperwork, not as a seller, not as a resident, just an asset in transition. I made myself a pot of tea, set the table for one, let the weight of it settle like the steam rising from my cup. He hadn't even asked. At twilight, I bundled up and walked to the cemetery, where Eira rested beneath a maple tree. The snow crunched beneath my boots, the cold biting at the tips of my fingers. I think they've decided I'm furniture now, I said aloud, ready to be stored or sold. I touched the edge of his stone, brushed off the snow, but I've still got moves left. That night, I laid out the blueprint folder on the dining table and began separating what I would keep from what I would leave behind. I labeled one box private, sealed it with heavy tape, and placed it near the stairs. Verity called me early Tuesday morning. The buyer had accepted. A private preservation trust based in Vermont, quiet, well-funded, and known for restoring historical homes with care. No contingencies. Full cash offer. Closing in 10 days. I thanked her, then stood in the middle of the living room and exhaled. Not relief, not yet, but something close. The next few days passed in quiet motion. I packed slowly, methodically. 3 boxes in total. One held Eira's old flannel shirts and the leather-bound journal he kept during the renovation, his handwriting still fierce, slanted full of sawdust and intention. Another was filled with my sketchbook's notes, scribbled in the margins from late-night design drafts when we had to stretch paint, thinner, farther than it was meant to go. The third box held only a letter written the night before, folded neatly in a cream envelope with Graham and Kendra's names inked across the front. I labeled the boxes with tape and moved them to the back hallway. Then I opened the carved walnut box Eira had made for our 25th anniversary. Inside was the brass key ring, one set for every lock in the house, polished and labeled. The front door key was worn smooth from years of use. The basement latch still had a dent from when Graham locked himself in, trying to find his Halloween decorations at age 6. I tied the keys together with a velvet ribbon and placed them in the box right beside the letter. The lid closed with a soft snap. Verity arranged for a courier to deliver the formal closing documents to my new temporary address. I signed them that evening at my small kitchen table alone with the same pen Eira used for the original purchase. No witnesses, no toast, just ink paper, and the finality of knowing the house would belong to someone who didn't see it as leverage. I placed the box and keys near the front door, exactly where I knew Graham would find them. And then I slipped the envelope into the inside panel, taped behind the glass, where it would catch the light. They returned on a Sunday, just after 4, the exact time I knew they would. Graham never liked traffic, and Kendra insisted on arriving before sunset. I watched from my new place, a small second-floor apartment overlooking a quiet square. The feed from the camera tucked in the porch light flickered onto my phone, clear, sharp, unforgiving. Their SUV pulled up slowly like they expected familiarity to be waiting for them. Kendra stepped out first, heels clicking on the stone walk. Graham followed, juggling bags and a carry-on already annoyed before his key touched the lock. It didn't turn. He tried again, harder this time. Kendra stood behind him, arms crossed, already blaming him for the inconvenience. I could see his jaw tighten. Then came the knock. The sharp, entitled knock of someone who believed a mistake had been made. No one answered. After several minutes, Graham circled around to the side entrance. Also locked. He returned, his voice sharp now, and that's when Kendra noticed the walnut box on the porch table. I saw her bend down, lift the lid, and pause. Her fingers brushed the velvet ribbon. Her mouth formed a question. Then she saw the envelope taped behind the glass. They opened it together. The camera couldn't capture every word on their faces, but I knew the moment they reached the line that mattered. The part where I told them the house had been sold. The part where I reminded them it had never belonged to them in the first place. Kendra blinked hard. Graham's hands shook. I imagined he was already calculating how much he'd lost plans, deferred loans, undone dreams he assumed were only waiting for me to step aside. I watched him sit down on the front step, elbows on his knees, staring at the porch like it had turned against him. Back in my apartment, I closed the app and set my phone face down. The silence around me felt earned. I boiled a small pot of water for tea, then walked to the window and opened it just enough to let the cool wind touch my face. By Monday afternoon, the voicemails had started. The first was short. Graham's voice was low, flat. "Mom, I think there's been some confusion. Call me." The second came an hour later. Longer, edged. "You sold the house without even telling me. What were you thinking I deleted both?" They showed up at Emmerich's door by Tuesday. He told me about it later over coffee at his kitchen table. They asked if I'd drawn up the contracts, he said with a faint smile. I reminded them I retired 8 years ago, and that more importantly, you never needed their permission. He stirred his tea slowly. Graham looked like he'd swallowed glass. I nodded. The tea was too sweet, but I didn't mention it. Back at my apartment, I lit a small candle beside Era's picture. He would have loved this, the sheer competence of it. He always said I was quiet until it counted, that I built slowly, but I never built weak. Later that week, the bank confirmed the funds had cleared. My account balance now held more commas than I'd ever seen in my life. Verity had arranged everything with the kind of ease that comes from years of dealing with other people's secrets. Graham's loan was revoked. I knew before he did. Kendra's mother, I heard, refused to co-sign the fallback plan. The Rhinebeck property was taken off the table. I signed a lease that Thursday. A modest cottage at the edge of a wooded hill with a wraparound porch and a narrow garden bed just waiting for lavender. The kind of place no one would expect me to choose and exactly where I needed to be. I didn't tell anyone. Not Emmerich, not the neighbors, not even the grocery clerk who always asked about the house on Maple Street. I wanted it to belong to no one's memory but mine. I brought only 3 boxes and a folded photo of Era at work in the bay window pencil tucked behind his ear. It sat on the kitchen shelf now, beside a small ceramic vase and a notepad I hadn't touched in years. I unpacked slowly in the new cottage, one drawer at a time. No rush. No one asking when dinner would be ready. No footsteps echoing with entitlement. Just the soft groan of floorboards under my own weight and the sound of birds settling outside the window. The first thing I placed was Era's flannel shirt, folded, worn, and still carrying the faint scent of cedar. I hung it on the back of the bedroom door where it would greet me in the morning. His toolbox went on the shelf above the coat rack. I didn't need the tools, but I needed the weight of them near me, proof of his hands, his care. By the end of the week, I had cleared a corner of the spare room for what I called the memory space. Not a shrine, not a museum, just a quiet place where the past could breathe without pressing in. I laid the blueprint of the old house on the table and pinned it flat beneath a glass sheet. In one corner sat the bay window sketch Era had drawn for me. Next to it, I placed a photograph, him standing in the early snow arms, crossed, grinning like a man who'd built something unshakable. I sat with it a while, then opened my phone and typed a message to Graham. Not a lecture, not a plea. I gave you a home, Graham. You treated it like a transaction, so I turned it into a legacy you'll never touch. There's nothing left to take. I've already started over. I hit send. No part of me waited for a reply. The next morning, I drank coffee on the porch as the fog curled between the trees. A quiet wrapped around me that didn't feel like loneliness anymore. It felt earned. Later, I drove into town and bought a small ceramic sign for the cottage gate. It read, Fox Ridge House, S2024. The woman at the register asked if I'd just moved in. Yes, I said. Just moved in. Starting fresh. Then I picked up a small clay pot and a pack of lavender seeds. By early spring, the lavender had started to take. Small green shoots nudged through the soil, stubborn and soft, reaching for a sun that still hesitated most mornings. I watered them with care the way Ira once taught me, gentle around the base, never too much at once. Each day felt more like mine. The neighbors kept their distance, polite but not curious. I liked it that way. There were no expectations here. No one asking what brought me to Fox Ridge or why I seemed to carry silence the way others carried handbags. I began teaching a small class once a week at the local community center. Interior basics for women who'd never had space to claim a room of their own. Most were retired, widowed, divorced women who had spent decades decorating around someone else's opinions. We talked about color light and how to make even a small place feel like a declaration. One afternoon, I stayed behind after class. The janitor was mopping the far corner. A woman named Scylla, maybe 50, with strong arms and tired eyes. She looked at the sketches I was rolling up. You used to do this for a living? I nodded. Once. A long time ago. She smiled. Bet you were good at it. I smiled back. I was. That night, I lit a candle beside Ira's photo and poured a glass of wine from the bottle I'd been saving. Not for any occasion. Just because the evening felt like it deserved it. The windows were open and the air carried the scent of soil and wind. Somewhere, an owl called out. I stood at the threshold of my new home, wrapped in a shawl, and looked out at the garden bed where tiny leaves had started to fan wider. They'd root deep if I let them. And I would. I would give them water, sun, patience. The same way I was giving myself a new beginning, not because I had to start over, but because I chose to. Not for Graham. Not for legacy. For me.